Welcome to the Vital Health Podcast. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation. Over the past year, the Inflation Reduction Act has moved from policy to active implementation. As the rollout has progressed, companies across the system have adjusted how they plan, assess risk, and make decisions, from early-stage investment in drug development to coverage and access. In this Policy Highlights edition of the Vital Health Podcast, we look back on the most important conversations we had in 2025 about the IRA and questions that matter going forward. You'll hear a wide range of perspectives from experts in healthcare and life sciences. I'll briefly introduce you to each guest as we go, and then we'll go straight into the clips. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers. Up next, we spoke with Doug Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum and former director of the Congressional Budget Office. If we look at the analysis that the CBO published specifically, and this is where you and I have gotten to know each other, we've been talking about this on several panels here on the Hill. What was intriguing to me, they did the analysis in what's called the aggregate. They did it at a sort of an average firm.
Yep.
Whereas we think, and what Peter is saying with his portfolio, he says, look, if I invest in small molecules now, oncology products, cancer drugs, that target an overwhelmingly Medicare population, I'm going to lose 40 to 50% of my profit. Yet the CBO didn't do an analysis at the indication level. And I think when you and I were discussing that...
indications are the key.
And when I brought that up, I mean, there was audible gasps among several congressmen in the room.
Oh, yeah.
Because the implications suddenly came quite to the front at that point.
So in the end, what matters is how beneficiaries are impacted. And indications tell you how many beneficiaries you're going to impact, not drugs.
Right.
Drugs is the wrong index. And so the focus was on the wrong thing. And I think that's become clear. And indications are going to be deeply affected by the IRA because the timing incentives are really different now.
Oh, yeah.
You used to just go to market with the first indication and then doing aftermarkets and getting more, and off you go. You get to Humira and God knows, 17, I think, maybe more. The incentive will be to keep it off the market until you have all the indications.
Yeah.
Then get it on the market, get your money for 9 years, and see how you do. So we will defer access to novel therapies. It doesn't make any sense.
At the point where they're most needed, or at least where there's the highest need, which is in late stage, non-treatable cancers, people who are metastatic and dying.
Right.
Oh, by the way, sorry, have a penicillin and an aspirin.
Yeah. So it's not been thought through. I think it just the legislation was rushed and it was very political. Like we're going to do this because we can, and we're going to show them we can take some of their money. This really was just political retribution to Republicans for putting in the non-negotiation provision originally. I mean, that's all that was, and pharma.
Getting to that, essentially what we're putting in now is a European-style price control, essentially.
Yes. No, not essentially.
It is.
It's in statute what the maximum fair price starts out as.
Yeah.
So that's a price control, and then you negotiate down from there.
Are you comfortable with the idea of us assuming these sort of European style?
No, not at all. As background, so I was at CBO. Bill got passed. We did the analysis on it, and the minute it's passed, the sort of non-negotiation clause becomes a political football, and I get the first of the letters. What would happen if you got rid of this clause? And we wrote back and said it would have essentially no material impact on the cost of the drugs or the bill as it was passed, because really negotiating, not what's in the IRA, but really having a negotiation between the Secretary of HHS and a pharma company didn't bring anything additional to the market. I mean, what can the Secretary do? They don't have a formulary. And if they tried to develop a formulary, they'd be telling some seniors what they could and could not get at the national level. That's never going to happen. So they didn't have any negotiating power. If you looked at a prescription drug plan, they had a formulary, they had a couple million beneficiaries, they had what was necessary to try to cut a deal for a better price on the drug. And the Secretary didn't bring anything to that. So if it was my world to run in, I would say to the next Congress, let's get rid of the tax, the excise tax for people who fail to negotiate in good faith. It's in that's a
95% tax.
That's the tax as a fraction of the price, including the tax. If you look at the tax as a fraction of the price net of tax, 1,900%.
Jeez.
So,
yeah, of course.
Yeah. You make $1, you hand 17 to the Treasury. It's meant to put you out of business, period. So get rid of that. Then get rid of the statutory language that says this is going to be at 45 to 70% of the ASP, whatever. So get that out.
Depending on the timing.
That's the pure price. That's a pure pricing thing. But don't take out the fact that they get to select 10 drugs and negotiate. And let's see how they do.
Where do you think it ends up?
I think we would end up back where we are.
I agree.
I really do.
I completely agree.
And you would get rid of the political baggage of having told the secretary they can't negotiate. Let them. I mean, it's a terrible job. Maybe they want to spend their time talking to drug companies.
Can you imagine?
No, I can't.
Can you imagine trying to negotiate with a fleet of pharma lawyers? Oh, my God. My idea of hell. It's bad enough to do contracts with them. You know?
No, I mean, honest to God, no, it's not for me. That's for sure.
What's really intriguing in the IRA legislation when you read it is when you get this exemption for having a generic competitor, the bill says, and I'm quoting, at the point of applicability. That's the language. Okay, fine. When we modeled it, we thought, well, that's when the price goes to the market. That's when the maximum fair price is put in. But CMS interpreted it under their Chevron deference to be, no, that needs to be in 2 years before when we start the negotiation. Now, if you look at biologics, they're going to be negotiated at year 11. You have 12 years of data protection. I mean, so there's no way. I mean, unless you're willing to open up.
No one's going to get it. It's an empty exemption.
Yes, precisely. Yes. So you're going to have at least a minimum of 1 year where you're going to be maximum fair priced, whether you want to or not. Have we Mickey Mouse ballooned with duct tape a solution to Hatch-Waxman or a fix to Hatch-Waxman, what people didn't like around IRA? Have we just basically not solved the real problem?
I think we know. Yeah, this is not a solution to a real problem. This is a solution to a political problem, which is we want to say that we, for the first time, are negotiating drugs in Medicare. And Republicans are wrong. We want to get pharma because they're evil, and we want to make things cheaper for the seniors and get a big thank you. The trouble is the cheaper for seniors part may not work out so well because their premiums are going to go up. They're in some bizarre cases, like you think of, go back to the anticoagulants, the Xarelto and Eliquis. They give you the maximum fair price. They stop using rebates to get preferred placement on formularies. Now, something that used to have zero copay comes with a copay.
Yeah.
The senior's going to be like, hey, what happened here? This used to be free to me. Now I got to pay for it. What is so great about this bill? So I think they ought to be careful about spiking the football too quickly. There are a lot of landmines in there.
Yeah, exactly. Or your branded drug that you like suddenly goes generic, but now the competitor comes in because they've negotiated with the PBMs directly, and that's going to be 3x, 4x the price. The branded generic gets price controlled, but there's going to be a 1 year gap, and then this other branded comes in because they're paying a higher rebate. It gets on the other preferred tier.
Yep.
Now you can't get the drug you wanted. I mean, there's so many perverse incentives in this bill.
There are a lot. And I have little doubt that the CMS guys did the arithmetic on the biosimilars pretty carefully, came up with how they interpret point of applicability. That's the lawsuit. I mean, you know that. And given the temperament of the Supreme Court recently, they could very well say, that's an overreach. Forget the Chevron deference. That was not the intent of Congress. You're done. And they'll throw the rule out for sure, but they may throw out
more parts of the bill.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly the 95% tax. Yeah. I mean, that could violate the taking clause. We'll have to see.
So I was, my fields in graduate school were public finance and monetary theory. And so tax policies near and dear to my heart. I'm a former editor of the National Tax Journal. Great read.
Sexy bathroom reading.
Yeah, the best. Well, I mean, it just offends me that anyone thinks that that's an appropriate use of the taxing powers of the federal government. It's that you're just taking. They're putting them out of business. That's the point of that. And I think it should be thrown out.
Up next, we spoke with Steve Usden, Senior Washington Editor at BioCentury Publications. Do you think there's an understanding that these industry leads that we've now carved out in biopharma is not an inevitability, that there are actually consequences to things like the IRA, things like tariffs?
I think that there's a growing awareness that American preeminence in the life sciences is not an inevitability, but I'm not sure that the attribution for the causes of the potential loss of competitiveness in the United States are accurately appreciated. And I think it's far too easy and facile to blame, for example, China, to blame nefarious actors and to say that that there was something malevolent that happened that's taking American preeminence in biotechnology away from the United States, when in fact, as we're going to talk about, I think a lot of the problems are self-inflicted wounds.
Yeah.
In the United States, I don't see how anybody can blame China or any other country for investing in biotechnology, for bringing the best people that they can, their attention and focus on developing the biopharmaceutical industry and trying to advance that for their own people and as a global commercial enterprise. What the United States needs to do is to run a lot faster. First, we need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot, cutting our arms and legs off, whatever kind of analogies you want to use. And then we need to think, well, what can we do to turbocharge innovation in the United States?
Picking up on that, part of the shooting ourselves in the foot and clubbing ourselves, or chopping off a leg and then beating ourselves in the head with our own leg, I guess. If we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, okay? Now, the Biden administration and Congress were adamant when this was passed that there would be virtually no impact on drug discovery due to the IRA. CBO, Congressional Budget Office, agreed with them. 2 years on, what do you think? What do you think of that assessment?
Well, you know more about it than I do.
All right, leading question of the morning. Fine.
This isn't really a fair question for you to be asking me. I should be asking you that, but because you've got the receipts. But here's the way that I look at it. To say that reducing the period of exclusivity for small molecule drugs to 9 years, which is essentially what the IRA did, and at the same time making the exclusivity period for large molecules 13 years, and then thinking that that's not going to have any impact on drug development, suggests that you don't really understand how drug development works.
Yeah.
The way that I see it, it's like these are great big boulders that have been placed into a river, and of course the water is going to continue flowing down the river, but it's going to flow in a different place because you've got those boulders there. So the predictable thing that will happen if you create a 9-year threshold for small molecule drugs and a 13-year threshold for large molecule drugs is for the drugs that are susceptible to so-called negotiation or price setting under the IRA, companies are going to prefer, all things being equal, to large molecule drugs. That's an enormous problem for a lot of reasons, okay? For one thing, there are conditions that really aren't susceptible to small molecule drug development. For another thing, small molecules are a lot more expensive. Large molecules are a lot more expensive than small molecules. Small molecules inevitably become generics, and the price goes down tremendously. Basically, the cost of production plus a few percentage.
Yeah.
Biologics, more than 50% of the biologics that are nearing the end of exclusivity, there's no biosimilar in the pipeline for them. And even if there is a biosimilar developed, it doesn't bring prices down anywhere near what happens with small molecules. And then if you look at it from the point of view of a patient, who wouldn't rather take a pill than have to go to to a hospital or to an infusion center and get an infusion or get an injection? The whole thing is skewed. If you were going to create an incentive and say, well, which would you prefer, small molecules or large molecules? The proper answer is to say you want whatever is going to be best for solving the problem that you're trying to solve, right? But if all things are equal, then of course you want the small molecule. You don't want the large molecule. I think that this was an entirely unintended feature of the IRA. I think you can trace it back to the debate about the creation of the biosimilars pathway, and at that time there were arguments on Capitol Hill from the biotech industry that biologics were far more complex than small molecules. The patent IP issues around biologics were different than they were around small molecules, and therefore they needed a longer period of exclusivity. And somehow that thinking got translated into the design of the IRA, and it doesn't make any sense.
Well, it was also hardwired into the Affordable Care Act as well, the ACA. So these differentials between exclusivity and market access are sort of already in that. And so you open up one, you got to open up the other. To me, it was always, the Inflation Reduction Act was essentially sticking a Mickey Mouse ear on a balloon to hatch Waxman. It's sort of, it seems like we're trying to solve an IP issue around a pricing legislation in Medicare. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
So I think if you take a step back and you say, well, why did Congress do this? I think in part there's some blame has to be put on the shoulders of the biopharmaceutical industry, because there's a sense in Congress that companies were violating what I call the social contract.
Mm-hmm.
And basically social contract under Hatch-Waxman is you get exclusivity for a set period of time, and then when that's over, your drug gets generic competition or biosimilar competition. The biopharma industry was playing a lot of different kind of games to try to extend their exclusivity beyond the period when it should have been. If anybody who argues to the contrary, I've just got one word for them. It's Humira.
Yeah.
That's and so there was that. And then there was also, the fact that there were attempts to come up with a bargain with legislation that would enforce the social contract and that would force companies basically to stop extending exclusivity past the period of time that it was intended in the Hatch-Waxman Act. And the industry decided that they didn't want to have any part of that. And they resisted coming to any kind of a deal with Congress. Senators Grassley and Wyden proposed legislation that, in retrospect, compared to the IRA, would have been a tea party for the industry. But the industry fought it and said, no, we don't want this. This is the nose under the tent, and we're not going to do it. And what happens? You get the IRA. It's difficult. The industry is pushing legislation. The EPIC Act.
EPIC Act. What do you think about the EPIC Act?
I don't think that the EPIC Act is going to pass.
Is it going to get thrown into reconciliation?
No.
I don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I know that that's what the industry wants to have happen. A bunch of CEOs went to see President Trump last month, and that was the top of their agenda. They said, please put the EPIC Act in reconciliation, and he said, no, I don't think it can happen. The Republicans have a razor thin majority in the House. They don't have a very robust majority in the Senate. It doesn't take much to basically to stop something from being inserted into reconciliation. You need near unanimity, and I don't think that they have the near unanimity that they're going to need to get the EPIC Act, which extends the threshold, the IRA negotiation threshold, from 9 years to 13 years for small molecule drugs.
Everything basically it's 13 years at that point.
I don't think that they have the near unanimity that they would need in order to get that into reconciliation. I could be wrong, but that's what I'm hearing.
So what happens then to these politicians who aren't willing to put EPIC into reconciliation when it starts becoming public that legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to force seniors, people of the Medicare age, to no longer be able to get new medicines to treat dementia, to treat cancer? What's going to be the blowback there? I would think that people are going to feel like they got a bait and switch, because this was sold to them, hey, we're going to save you money in Medicare. And in fact, what it means is you're going to save money because you're not going to get any new drugs in Medicare.
Well, so there's two things there, okay? One of them is that you really can't underestimate the antipathy of the American people and of politicians to the biopharmaceutical industry. So I don't think it's going to be, I don't think that there's any politician in America thinks that it's a winning strategy to go out and say, look, folks, I did something great for the biotech and the pharmaceutical industries. I wish that were the case, but it certainly isn't, okay? And the other thing is that it's very difficult to convince people that something that could have happened didn't happen because of a public policy, because of a law. You believe that. I believe that. You've got the receipts to demonstrate that it's the case. But you can go all across the whole public policy spectrum, not just in the life sciences, and show areas where politicians and the public are unmoved by the threat that something good didn't happen because there was a barrier that was put in the way. So that's a very difficult argument to make.
I know it's a difficult argument to make, but the reality is, if people are going to start saying, hey, wait a minute, there's these new drugs that are coming in China, there's these new drugs that are coming from Singapore, which will start happening. I think people are going to start, much like the Europeans now are complaining, well, hey, wait a minute, why are we paying for all these American companies? We don't have an indigenous sector anymore. I think the problem is you don't realize it until it's gone.
Well, that's the point. There's a very long lag. By the time it becomes completely obvious, in a sense, it's
too late.
It's too late, or it would take an enormous amount to catch up. But there's always there's going to be a lag, right? The research that you've done, that others have done, looking at reduction in clinical trial starts for small molecule drugs for chronic conditions that affect the elderly, investment in those kinds of drugs and things like that. That's the beginning of a cycle that at a minimum is going to take, 5-6 years to become extremely obvious, right?
Yeah.
And again, then if you wait until it becomes obvious and you say, okay, we're going to put some kind of policies in effect to undo the damage, then you have to wait another
5 to 6 years
to see the benefits of it. And of course, whatever companies or countries have taken advantage of the fact that we've created this gap aren't going to be standing still for that 5 or 6 years. They're going to be running forward.
Do you see that there's a growing awareness of that problem? I mean, are people starting to connect those dots that, hey, wait a minute, maybe we've gone too far here? Obviously not publicly because of the political blowback, but I mean, you're privy to a lot of these conversations. You're one of the sharp knives in the drawer in this town, Steve. Are they confiding, yeah, we need to do something here?
No,
not at all.
No, I don't. When I talk to lobbyists, when I talk to members of Congress, when I talk to congressional staff, this isn't the top 5, 10 issues that they're concerned about at all. I think that the reports that are coming out about China getting ahead of the United States in biomedical innovation will cause that conversation to shift to some extent. But I don't think that it's going to shift in the way that you're thinking it will.
Well, how do you think it's going to shift?
I think that, so if you look at the issues around China, there are two ways to think about it. One way to think about it, and I think it's a correct way to think about it, is what can the United States do to run faster? What can the United States do to outcompete China? And that's the way that most of the people who are really savvy about life sciences, pharmaceuticals, that's the way people think about it. The other way to think about it is the way that the national security establishment tends to think about it, which is how can we throw sand in the gears, in their gears? How can we slow them down? What we need to do is to inhibit China. I think that that's a unrealistic goal. I don't think it's something that we can do. I don't think it's something that we should do. But I think that the more urgent the cries become, people reach for that easier to understand option, and they think, well, we can. What we need to do is to erect higher barriers to U.S. investment in China or collaboration with Chinese companies or something like that. So I think that's the kind of like the natural tendency where people go.
Up next, we spoke with Joe Hamming, U.S. Business Director at Vital Transformation, and Harry Bowen, Consulting Economist at Vital Transformation, as well as Virginia Acha, Associate Vice President of Science and Regulatory Policy at Merck Sharp & Dahm. If you look at the study we published, which is called the Inflation Reduction Act's Impact Upon Early Stage Venture Capital Investments, and you compare that to, say, what the CBO had put out, Director General Swagel in December of 2023 was quite adamant that they saw no impacts from IRA and what was coming down. when you actually folded this back and built the data set that specifically looked at early stage investing, so not the mature trees that, a company like Ginny's is chopping down to make lumber, but, the stuff at the front end where we're planting the seedlings, the people who are taking the real risk capital, what you're really seeing is that what was sold as a benefit to the Medicare age population for reduced cost, what it actually has done is investors are going, I've already got a 92% failure rate, now I'm not going to take a 50% hit on revenue. And we can actually show, particularly with those small molecules, that there are people pulling away. Harry, why would an investor suddenly say, I'm done, I'm not going into this space, particularly with Medicare exposure? Why would they do that?
If I have a longer time to have exclusivity in the market, then that's going to make that particular investment more attractive. And what has happened was the pill penalty, as it's called, with small molecules already came up potential for price negotiation after 9 years, but large molecules were at 13 years. And so this created, as we showed in our paper, a disincentive in terms of how investors now, just starting out thinking about the future, are saying, why do I want to invest in a drug where I only have, let's say, 9 years of exclusivity when I can invest in another drug with 13 years of exclusivity? And that means more profits, right? And it also makes it more viable that the drug would be researched and potentially created because you have a larger stream of potential profits that can cover those expenditures for research and development and other activities that are necessary to create that drug.
Ginny, why do you think there was such a misunderstanding about how this market works? I mean, you're obviously in the industry. Even as far as Rita Conti's testimony last April, where she said, we're still seeing no evidence of this. And what's fascinating is it was really, everyone was grabbing the publicly available data, which is mostly, Merck, Pfizer, Amgen, the big elephant companies, the big ones. Why did they just not understand where the impacts were going to be? Why did this not connect?
Well, and I think, you mentioned about smaller companies or investors. I think you're right. I think they misunderstood, as Harry's just described, they misunderstood how R&D in drug discovery and development works, but I think they also misunderstood how R&D investment works. And they've been looking at global figures, sort of number of drugs or overall R&D spend. I mean, I've made this point before also with Rena. You may not see my R&D figures go down, but we weren't going to leave the industry, but it does mean that we do things differently. So they didn't understand what I think Steve Usden put really nicely in a BioCentury article where he said, the IRA essentially moved the rocks in the river. So don't be surprised that the river flows differently. Well, it doesn't mean that the river doesn't flow. It is going to flow differently. And if you don't understand those impacts, then you run into the conclusions that Joe already mapped out.
If you look at some of the biologics, I mean, still, and we can discuss if 20 years is the right number, but biologics generally have had 20 years in the market, ones that are targeting Medicare. Now they're going to drop by 13. I mean, that's still multiples of billions of dollars sucked out of the sector. I mean, this is still, we're still going to make the pie smaller. We got boulders in the river, but we're also putting a dam up and we're reducing the flow a little bit too. Harry, what's going to happen there? I mean, if we're reducing that flow?
Ginny had a good point, and I think that's the idea that, people respond to changes in relative gains, right? The gain of this is now looks better relative to another one. But I also think that, as part of that switching idea that we've talked about with, going more to large molecule rather than small molecule, I think that it will also reduce the overall level of R&D because there's just fewer investment opportunities. I think that drug companies certainly are looking for the magic one, the blockbuster, as we found in other research, and that, something like 20% of all the R&D that's done funds 20% 20% of all the revenue that's earned funds 80% of all the R&D.
Well,
right?
20%, 20 drugs, actually 20 drugs.
20 drugs, yeah.
20 drugs fund over 50% of all R&D fluid.
And I've always liked your analogy to the movie industry with the blockbuster movie, and that's what funds all the independents and all the other ones. And if you don't have a chance to realize some of these blockbusters, which take enormous amounts of money, I think you will see fewer drugs. So to go back to Jenny's point about access, I mean, as an economist, I would immediately say access, price, same thing to me. But I think, it's just a consequence of, and again, restricting prices, making everything, hey, it's free. You can get it for free, but you can't find it anywhere. That's the problem. So that's the access part.
Joe.
Well, I want to go back to the fundamental problem with legislation like this. I think it goes back to this unbelievable lack of understanding of this marketplace, of the environment, and how drugs are developed. And I've wrestled with this for decades in my career, and I've always been very frustrated because, again, there's a feeling that developing drugs is like developing any commodity, that where you just create the stuff and you sell it and you just move on. What is probably one of the most hard to describe, hard to teach issues with the industry is the failure rate. And that's what differentiates the biopharmaceutical industry from all others. The failure rate, especially in some areas, let's be honest, Alzheimer's and the others, is astronomical. 99%, essentially. We can argue with the decimals. It's just not the same thing as developing other products. If that isn't understood and it isn't appreciated, then you're really having a hard time to make this point and to get busy legislators, busy staffers to really understand what's going on. And that's why you end up with these unintended consequences. We're going to do this to reduce prices, and we're going to get just as many drugs out of it by, again, rearranging these boulders. And then we're going to look at it after all that rearranging is done, and we go, wait a minute. That didn't work out the way we thought it was going to work out. And that's what we're seeing here. The industry, I'm afraid to say, has done a very poor job over decades of explaining what drug development looks like, how difficult it is, how expensive it is, and how many products fail. And somehow, some way, that failure has to be paid for. And that is through revenues of successful products. It's just that simple.
Ginny, are you seeing changes in the way you folks are sourcing, targeting indications, buying companies, partnering with companies based on exposure to Medicare? Are you being more strategic? We've seen a ton of cardiovascular disease assets come in, not just the GLP-1s and the obesity, but there's even more stuff going there. We've seen the neurology acquisitions, depression, and schizophrenia. That's 18-year-old female, 24-year-old male. I mean, that's way down the line from Medicare population. Do you think this is an intentional approach to try and avoid IRA?
So I think you should obviously pay attention to what people say in their quarterly earnings calls, and I'm sure you all have heard the same as I have from some of the other companies where they've actually described some hard decisions that they've had to take. And I will say they're hard decisions. Joe knows this from personal experience. When you have researchers who've been working on an area for a long time, that's a baby. They don't like giving those up, and certainly not easily. But as I said earlier, it adds another layer on the chessboard. So you have to think about it. It's not the only thing that you'll think about. That's never true. There are many reasons why you follow particular paths, areas of unmet need where you have scientific opportunity, where something is, looking right. But just to make the point that, again, one of the boulders we talked about was small molecule versus large molecule. That's a big deal. But another thing to think about in indication development is also the therapeutic areas where disease progression is slow.
Yeah.
Or it takes a long time to establish. So one of the things that we've been particularly, keen to point out is this is if you've got a really artificially constrained period of time to do your development, your chances of getting into early stage treatments for cancer are going to become harder and harder to achieve, because I'm just not going to be able to have enough time built in to build out that clinical program in the right possible way. And things like dementia or Alzheimer's, where you have, again, slow progression. This is just anathema. Where you need time to do it, it's going to make it more difficult. And obviously, we don't want to see that happen, but your own study is obviously raised a lot of concerns. People intended these changes, and what do they do when they see those changes happening? The question I have, and I'm going to put back to you all, is how reversible is this? You know?
Let's face it, it's hard. One of my favorite examples, if you go back to the war on infectious diseases, back when the first antibiotics were developed, it was a miracle. People who had, just a regular old infection no longer died from it. It was life-changing. It was incredible. We really thought, science, thought that we had won the war against infectious diseases like bacteria. Well, what happened is there was a lack of investment, a drop-off in investment. Companies didn't go after new antibiotics because we didn't understand what was coming, which is antimicrobial resistance and all those sorts of problems. Well, when you stop investing in something and the intellectual capital goes on to do something else, they move into cardiovascular or they do something else, the chemical matter that's there and ready to be developed sits on the shelf, loses patent protection, etc. The bottom line is it takes decades to build that back up again. And that can happen in any area. When you see, one of the things that worries me most are the decisions around Alzheimer's disease right now and dementia in general. There's been failure after failure after failure, as we've alluded to earlier in this conversation. Those failures eventually turn off more and more investors, companies, people who are willing to put capital at risk. That's not a good thing. If there's a problem with reimbursement, that's another nail in the coffin, if you will. And that just leads to fewer and fewer opportunities going forward. So even though we're looking at trillions of dollars of medical healthcare costs over time, something like Alzheimer's, we're not cracking the problem. And I'm afraid that if we don't start making some significant advances in the field soon, there will still be efforts, but I'm afraid that many really good ideas are going to, go by the wayside. They're going to lie fallow.
Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.